All right, so after my recent response video to Tucker Carlson's interview with Jay Dyer, I've kind of noticed something as I was kind of surveying the different comments left in the comment section of that video. And what I've kind of noticed there is that there seems to be a pretty big gap between what many Catholics and Orthodox think Protestants mean whenever we say that we're justified by faith alone, and what Protestants have historically meant when we use that phrase all throughout church history. Now, to be fair, right, because I always like to be fair in these kind of things, I don't think that all of the confusion necessarily falls on Catholics and Orthodox here. I don't think that's fair to them because I would actually, admit and readily acknowledge that I do think that some Protestants are to blame here too, right? I fully recognize that there are many Protestants who haven't exactly always done the best job in explaining what we mean by faith here either, right? Sometimes we spend so much time, defending justification by faith alone that we never really stop and define what we actually mean by the word faith, which, it's kind of simple, but it's very important. And as you know, when you don't stop to define your terms, what usually happens? Well, as we all know and probably have experienced sometime in our life, people are naturally going to start defining those terms for you. And so I wanted to make this short video to kind of clear up what I think is one of the biggest misunderstandings surrounding the Protestant doctrine of justification by faith alone. You see, when Protestants say that we're justified by faith alone, people, we're not saying that we're justified by mere intellectual assent alone. That's not what we believe, right? We're not saying that someone can simply agree with a few facts about Jesus, check off a few theological boxes in their minds, and then somehow God looks at all of that and then declares them righteous. Yeah, I don't recognize that. That's not what historic Protestants have typically believed. That's not exactly what we mean, right? When a Protestant reads Ephesians 2, verse 8 through 9, we do not understand Paul to be saying that we're somehow saved by grace through mere intellectual assent alone, right? That's ridiculous. I mean, think about it for a moment, right? You don't need a supernatural grace of God to simply acknowledge a few facts about Jesus, right? James tells us in chapter 2 of his letter that even demons believe certain truths about God, right? They know who Jesus is. They know who he's the Son of God. They know he died and rose again. And yet, James is very, very clear that that kind of belief by itself doesn't save, right? And we'll come back to that passage a little bit later. But, for now, I just want you to see the point that I'm making, right? And so if that's what some Catholics and Orthodox think Protestants mean, then honestly, I completely understand why the doctrine of justification by faith alone would sound absolutely stupid to you because, the position that you're actually rejecting is actually stupid, right? But the good news is that that's not actually the position that we're defending, and that's not what the doctrine of justification by faith alone teaches. You see, when Protestants speak about saving faith, we're talking about trusting in Christ, depending on Christ, relying on Christ, resting in Christ, and placing our entire hope entirely in Christ and his finished work for our salvation. That, my friends, is what we mean by faith. And I think, maybe a simple analogy can help illustrate exactly what we're saying here. You see, imagine if I told you, I believe this chair is going to hold me up. Now, what do I mean by that, right? Am I simply saying that I acknowledge a few facts about this particular chair that I'm sitting in, that I know it's made of wood and leather, that it has 4 legs, that I believe that exists? Well, of course not. Of course, you understand that's not what I'm saying, right? What I'm saying is that I trust this particular chair enough to place my full body weight on it, right? I depend on this chair to hold me up. I'm relying on it not to collapse as I'm recording this video, right? Do you see this difference, right? The first is simply believing that this chair exists, right? Anybody can do that. The second is believing in the chair to do what it was designed to do, which is hold me up as I'm recording this video and explaining these things to you, right? That's the distinction, right? And so when Protestants speak about saving faith, we're not merely talking about, believing that Jesus exists, right? We're talking about believing in Jesus and trusting ourselves in Christ, right? Relying upon him, resting completely in him for our entire salvation, right? That's much more than simply agreeing with a certain set of facts about Jesus. No, That is trust. That's reliance. That's dependence. And that's very different than mere intellectual assent. And I would actually argue that that's exactly how Jesus teaches us, how to think about faith all throughout the Gospels. Just think about all the different pictures that Jesus uses to describe our relationship with him, what it means to truly have faith in him and believe in him. Notice how he says things like, I am the bread of life, or I'm the door, or I'm the vine, or I'm the good shepherd, right? What are all of these illustrations meant to teach us, right? Well, it's meant to teach us what it means to believe in him. Take the door, for example. What do you do with a door? Well, you enter through it. Or think about the vine. What do branches do? Well, it abides in the vine because apart from the vine, it has no life. Or consider the good shepherd. What do sheep do? Right? Well, they follow their shepherd because they trust him. They believe in him to lead them. My friends, do you see the pattern? Jesus keeps giving us picture after picture of what it looks like to depend on him, to rely on him, to trust in him, to abide in him, because that's how he wants us to think about the nature of saving faith, right? He's not merely handing us a list of facts that we have to mentally affirm. Rather, he's painting for us a picture of what it looks like to completely entrust yourself to him, right? And I think that's one of the biggest misunderstandings in this entire conversation. You see, when Protestants say that we are justified by faith alone, we are not talking about merely believing that Jesus exists or agreeing that Christianity is true. Again, unbelievers can kind of do that. We understand, just like as you do as Catholics and Orthodox, that a mere acknowledgement of facts cannot save anyone. Okay. Rather, we're talking about entrusting ourselves completely to Christ and Christ alone as our only hope before a holy and a righteous God. That is the faith that we're talking about. Now, at this point, I know some of my Catholic and Orthodox friends might respond to that by saying, okay, Chennai, I hear you. I understand the Protestant definition of faith a little bit better now, but doesn't your doctrine still have God simply declaring an unbeliever to be righteous, right? Doesn't that still make justification merely legal without anything actually changing in the person? Isn't that the case? And I think the simple answer to that question is no. In fact, just think about the language that we use to describe someone who has truly been saved here, right? When a Protestant talks about someone who has placed their faith in Christ, if you notice, we no longer describe that person as an unbeliever. Now they're what? They're a believer. Now that alone should tell you that we believe that something has actually changed in the life of that person, right? Sometimes, what I've kind of noticed is I feel like I just think that Catholics and Orthodox kind of hear the Protestant position and maybe they interpret it as us saying something like this, an unbeliever places his faith in Christ and yet somehow remains an unbeliever. But guys, we think that is just as nonsensical as you do. You see, we believe that when an unbeliever places their saving faith in Christ, he ceases at that very moment to be an unbeliever. Now he's a believer. And I know that sounds incredibly simple, but sometimes it's the simplest observations that are the ones that bring the most clarity. As that's what I've kind of noticed. Now, before somebody jumps into the comment section and starts to go in any and every direction with this, let me be very, very clear. I'm not trying to settle every debate about the exact order of salvation, right? Protestants have had, many internal discussions for centuries about how faith and regeneration and justification all relate to one another, right? That's an important conversation, but it just isn't the conversation that we're having here today. Rather, the point that I'm trying to make is actually much, much simpler. What I'm trying to get across to you is that the Protestant position has never been that an unbeliever simply remains an unbeliever while God somehow just changes his disposition, his attitude toward him. That simply wouldn't be accurate of a description of what Protestants have historically believed. Rather, we believe that the person has truly entrusted himself to Christ. He has truly placed his hope in Christ. He has abandoned every other confidence for salvation and is now relying solely and completely upon Jesus Christ to save him. And so from the Protestant standpoint, that's not someone just remaining in their unbelief. No, at that point, that's a genuine believer. Now, is that the end of God's work in that person's life? Well, of course not, right? No one would say that it is. And we'll talk about more about that in just a moment. But before we do, I actually want to push this conversation one step further, because I think this is where we finally arrive at what I think is the real disagreement that we are having between Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox. You see, from my vantage point, the disagreement has never really been over whether Christians are changed, right? If you study these debates long enough, if you study the position of the Catholics and the Orthodox and even of the Protestants, you'll realize that everyone basically agrees that God transforms his people in some way, shape, or form. Rather, the real disagreement is this: on what basis does God declare us to be righteous? That's the real question. You see, historically, Protestants have answered that question by saying that God declares us righteous because we are united to Christ by faith, and we now possess a righteousness that is not of our own, but is Christ. And I want you to notice that this is an idea that somehow begins with the Reformers. You'll kind of hear this language in the comment section and with many other Catholics and Orthodox, but my friends, that simply is not true, right? This is one of the biggest frustrations that I have whenever I defend Protestant beliefs. It's like, no, we're not getting these ideas from Luther or Calvin. We're getting them from Paul himself, right? In fact, this doesn't even begin in the New Testament. And we can actually just go all the way back to Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, right? Speaking of Abraham, the text says this: Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as what? As righteousness. Now, I want you to notice the language there, because it's really, really important that we kind of grasp what was just said there. You see, the text doesn't say that Abraham's faith was a work that earned him righteousness. No, doesn't say that. Rather, it says that righteousness was what? Counted to him. It was credited to him, right? And centuries later, Paul points back to this very verse in Romans chapter 4 and Galatians chapter 3, for an example, to show us that this has always been God's pattern of saving his people. And that's ultimately why Paul can say something so remarkable in Philippians chapter 3. And I would really encourage you to just take a moment out in your day and just do a slow read through that chapter, because I think it's absolutely beautiful. In that chapter, Paul looks back over his life. And if anyone could have pointed to his own righteousness as as part of the basis of his acceptance before God, look, it was Paul. He had the pedigree, he had the zeal, he had the obedience. By his own testimony, he was blameless according to the righteousness found in the law. That's what he says there. And yet, after listing all of his accomplishments, right, all of what he did in his life as a Jew, he says this: I count them as loss, that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness which comes from God on the basis of faith. My friends, that is the Protestant doctrine in a nutshell. We do not deny that God transforms believers, or that Christians grow in holiness, or that good works matters. In fact, we're going to spend the entire latter half of this video talking about exactly that. So don't worry, we're going to get to it. But what we do deny is that our growing in righteousness is the basis upon which God declares us to be righteous. That's the difference. Rather, we believe that Christ's righteousness is counted to us through faith, just as righteousness was counted to Abraham through faith, right? That's why Paul can say in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, that he made him, God made Christ, who knew no sin, to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in who? In Christ, in him. And again, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 30, Paul says that Christ himself has become to us wisdom from God, and what? And righteousness and sanctification and redemption. In other words, my friends, when you believe in Christ, the moment that you place saving faith in Christ, he becomes your everything. Okay, he is your righteousness, he is your sanctification, he's your wisdom, he is your redemption, he's all of it and more. And yes, although Protestants believe that believers are transformed and grow in holiness, we simply make the careful distinction that our acceptance before a holy and a righteous God rests solely upon Christ's righteousness that is credited to us by faith, right? Not upon our righteousness that we gain in our growth in holiness in this Christian life, right? We would reject that. Now, look, you may still disagree with that conclusion, and that's perfectly okay. That's your right to, and that's your prerogative to do so. But I hope by this point, you can at least see that what we've described here is much, much richer than the caricature that Protestants somehow believe that someone can merely agree with a few facts and nothing can change in the believer, and that all the while, God will somehow arbitrarily look at all of that, look at none of the change that happens in a believer, and simply declare that person to be righteous, right? That's simply not the doctrine that we're defending here. And so if you're going to reject justification by faith alone, then, my friends, actually reject the doctrine that we actually believe, right? And so now that we've clarified what Protestants actually mean by faith, and even what we believe happens when someone places that faith in Christ, I think that leaves us with what is probably the biggest question of all. And I know some of you are just itching for me to talk about this, which is this fundamental question. If Protestants say that we're justified by faith alone, then what role do works actually play in the life of the believer? And, as I've been making, these videos over the past several months, I think one of the biggest reasons that this conversation becomes so confusing for a lot of people is because, just so many people don't even realize that Paul and James are actually answering two totally different questions. You see, Paul, in places like Galatians and Romans and Ephesians, is actually answering the question, how is a sinner declared righteous before God, right? But that's not the question that James is answering. Again, all you got to do is just look at the context and read the letter in its context to see this, right? James is answering the question, how do you recognize whether someone's profession of faith is actually genuine, right? Because remember, in the context of it, he's rebuking this covenant community for neglecting the poor, for literally having this kind of favoritism, and they're totally comfortable with it. And yet all the while they're proclaiming that they're Christian, right? They proclaim that they have faith in Christ. And so Paul is like, I don't think you do, right? If you did, you wouldn't be comfortable with this. And so do you see how Paul and James are addressing two totally different questions? And I think once you begin to see that distinction, James chapter 2 is going to start to become incredibly clear for you. In fact, I just want you to remember the illustration that we actually used a bit earlier in this video. Again, suppose that I told you, I believe that this particular chair is going to hold me up, right? It's going to carry my body weight. Again, we're not talking about merely believing that this chair exists, but we're talking about believing in the chair to do what it was designed to do. Remember, there's two different types of belief. Belief that, which is just mere mental assent. And you got belief in, that's trust, that's obedience, that's dependence, that's reliance. That's what we're talking about here. Now, I want you to imagine that I make that statement and you respond by saying, okay, Janai, I hear that you say you believe this chair is going to hold you up. Show me. Right? How do I show you that I actually believe that this chair is going to hold me up? Well, the answer is obvious. I need to sit in it, right? Now, I want you to think very carefully about what exactly is happening here, because it's really important. Did me sitting in the chair create my trust in the chair? No, right? What did sitting in the chair actually do in this scenario? Well, it just revealed that the trust that I claimed to have was already there, right? It demonstrated that my trust was real. It vindicated my claim. It showed that my profession was actually genuine to you. And my friends, that's exactly what James is talking about in James chapter 2. Listen to what James says in chapter 2, verse 18. He says, show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. Now, this is actually where I really just want everybody just to slow down, right, for 2 seconds, because I think this verse is incredibly important. I want you to notice what James does not say. He doesn't say, I will earn my faith by my works. right? He doesn't say my works create my faith. He says, I will show you my faith, right? Who is he showing? He's showing the covenant community that he's writing to. I'm going to show you my faith by my works. Do you see the difference? Works, my friends, are the evidence that saving faith is alive. They're the evidence that the profession of faith is genuine. They're not the root, they're the fruit, right? As we Protestants like to say. You see, James is asking the covenant community a very practical question. How do I know whether your claim of faith is mere intellectual assent or whether you've truly entrusted yourself to Christ? Right? Because here's the reality. Faith itself is invisible. We all know this, right? It's not like some X verification badge that's kind of floating over somebody's name that says, oh, this person is, actually does have saving faith, right? You can't see faith that directly. We know this. And so how is genuine faith made visible to us? Well, it's going to be through the life that it produces. And that's James' entire point, my friends. And then as we keep reading, James gives one of the most profound illustrations in the entire New Testament. Again, he says that even demons believe that God is one, right? And I want you to think about that for a moment. The demons have perfect intellectual assent, right? They know exactly who Jesus is, who the Father is, who the Spirit is. Frankly, those demons probably have better theological knowledge than your best theologian that's ever walked the face of this earth, right? And yet, even with all that knowledge, they don't trust in him. They don't rely on him. They don't rest in him. They don't hope in him for their salvation. And it's because they don't trust in him that they don't delight in obeying God. They don't keep his commandments, hence why they were cast out in heaven. Right. And so that's the kind of faith that James is explicitly rejecting here. And that's the kind of faith that Protestants, too, historically have constantly over and over again rejected. Right. We reject the faith that never moves beyond intellectual assent because we don't think that's the kind of faith that saves. Again, that kind of faith is belief that God exists. We are focused on belief in God. Two totally different things, right? That's why Protestants have never been afraid of looking through James chapter 2. I know people like to bring up, oh, Martin Luther kind of wrestled with the book of James. Hey, look, guys, let me help you out, right? Because I try not to resort to calling anybody any names, but that objection to a Protestant is completely stupid, especially when you consider the fact that that's very early on in Martin Luther's life. And he's human. He's going to wrestle with things. But if you look at the progression of his life, he ended up accepting the book of James. So bringing up the fact that he wrestled with the book of James is like, whoop-de-doo. You're not proving anything. It's literally brain rot that I have to keep answering objections to this. And I really want Catholics and Orthodox to move past that because Martin Luther isn't our Pope or our patriarch in the Orthodox sense. He's none of that. He's just a dude that got a lot of things right and kind of led this Reformation standpoint. But even if you go back to people like John Hus, he wasn't even the first one. Okay, so please spare me. We're not afraid of James chapter 2, right? And the reason why we're not afraid is because we completely understand that James isn't correcting Paul's doctrine of justification. And he certainly isn't adding some second stage of justification that Paul somehow forgot to mention in Ephesians chapter 2 and Galatians chapter 2 and Romans and et cetera, et cetera. Rather, James is simply correcting people, new covenant people who were engaging in things like partiality and loose lips and things of that nature, right? Who claim to have faith while living as though they didn't actually trust in Christ, right? And we see this principle all throughout the New Testament, right? What does Jesus say? He says, a good tree bears what? Good fruit. Now, I want you to notice the order because the order is really important here. Does the fruit make the tree itself alive? No, we know that. That's simple agricultural knowledge right there. Does the fruit combine with the tree somehow make it good? No, that's not what Jesus says. The tree comes first. It's good, right? Faith is what makes that tree good. And then the good fruit follows from that good tree. The fruit, as you can see, simply reveals the nature of the tree. And that makes perfect sense of what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2, right? In that chapter, Paul tells us that we're saved by grace through faith apart from works. right? That's the gospel, my friends. You want to know what the gospel? That's the gospel in a nutshell. That's how we're justified before God. But then only 2 verses later, Paul says that those same people, those who have been saved by grace through faith, guess what? They were created in Christ for what? For good works, which God has already prepared for them to walk in. And again, I want you to notice the order here. It's grace that comes first, then faith, then good works. The works, as you see in this whole equation, does not produce salvation. Salvation produces the good works. And so when Protestants say that we're justified by faith alone, we're not describing the faith that merely, sits in someone's back of their mind like a collection of random facts about Jesus. That's stupid, right? Rather, we're talking about a faith that completely entrusts itself to Christ. And because that faith is living, it inevitably produces good fruit, not because the fruit justifies the faith, but because that's simply what living things do. Living things produce things. A living tree produces fruit. A living branch produces grapes. And a living faith, guess what? Works through love, just as Paul said in Galatians chapter 5, verse 6, right? That's why Protestants can wholeheartedly affirm James chapter 2. It's because we simply understand James to be answering a fundamentally different question than Paul, right? Paul, as a recap, explains how a sinner is justified before God. James explains how genuine faith is recognized before men. And when those two questions are kept distinct, the two apostles fit beautifully together rather than standing in opposition to one another. Now, if you're Catholic and Orthodox, and after hearing all of this and you still come to the conclusion that you disagree with justification by faith alone, look, that's perfectly okay. It's kind of not because it's the gospel, but it's perfectly okay. My goal wasn't to convince you that to kind of become a Protestant in 20 minutes. Rather, my goal was simply to make sure that if you reject the Protestant doctrine of justification by faith alone, then please, for the life of me, reject the doctrine that we actually believe, not a caricature of it, okay? Because I think all of us, regardless of our tradition, should want to, represent one another fairly before we critique one another, right? At least that's what y'all always ask us Protestants to do. And so I'm simply asking you to do the same, right? That's simply what the golden rule requires. And so if all of us are followers of Jesus, I would think that we all would want to listen to him, right? But anyways, guys, that's the video. Look, I genuinely love to hear your thoughts down in the comment sections. Did this help clarify for you what Protestants actually mean when we talk about faith, right? Is there anything else that you would disagree with here or want me to address in a future video? Let me know. I love to interact with y'all. And also, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget, like, share, subscribe, do all that good stuff, as it really does help the channel out a lot. And until next time, guys, peace.